they were instrumental in changing, as far as I'm concerned, everything they touched. There wasn't anything that they didn't touch, and with three guitars and a drum, you know, that's crazy. I mean, how does anybody do that?
These youngsters from Liverpool, England.
The significance is that the Beatles have held this title for 8 years.
My model of business is the Beatles. They were four very talented guys.
Hello, I'm Jack, and you're listening to the Here, There, and Everywhere podcast, an interview show about the Beatles' influence in the past, present, and future across the universe and across generations. Welcome back to the Here, There, and Everywhere podcast. I am Jack, and I'd like to introduce a very, very special guest for today's podcast. He goes by the name of Ernie Cefalu. For those who don't know Ernie, he is one of the most influential artists in rock and roll history. Ernie's designed countless iconic album covers, such as Jesus Christ Superstar, Alice Cooper's School's Out, and he's even designed the iconic tongue logo for the Rolling Stones. Over the span of only 14 years, Ernie created 183 album covers for rock legends like The Doors, Aerosmith, The Bee Gees, The Guess Who, Black Sabbath, Jefferson Airplane, Grand Funk Railroad. The list goes on. He's received 3 Grammy nominations for his work, 10 Music Hall of Fame awards, 4 awards of excellence from the Los Angeles Art Directors Club, and he's been presented with 25 gold albums and a triple platinum album by some of the bands whose album covers he's designed. Ernie is also the owner of the largest privately owned original album cover art collection in the world, with over 350 signed originals and 3,000 photographs. You can check that out on originalalbumcoverart.com. In 2015, Ernie was inducted into the Album Cover Hall of Fame, and he is just getting started. And he is a huge fan of the Beatles. So let's jump right into the interview. Hey, Ernie, thank you so much for coming on. It's great to talk to you again. How are you doing?
Good, man. Thank you, Jack. Thank you for having me on. You look the same as you did a bunch of months ago. You didn't change much. I got older. Thank you for letting me come on. I really appreciate it.
Absolutely.
I'm a big Beatles fan. Even though I did the Rolling Stones logo, I'm a big Beatles fan.
So, Ernie, for those who don't know the amazing work you've done, can you give us a brief rundown of the incredible things you've done and how you got there and how you got started?
Well, yeah, you mean like mostly the album cover stuff, right?
Totally.
Yeah, I started out in 1969 when I went to New York after graduating college to work on Madison Avenue, because that's what all ad people want to do. And that was a dream, an aspirational dream. And while I was working on Madison Avenue, one of the agencies that I worked for had Decca Records as an account. And they were getting ready to lose the account because of the 2 art directors that worked at the agency left the agency and was taking the client with them. I went to work for this agency because they were losing the account and they didn't have anybody to compete in their roster of art people that were there in the agency. It was a big agency in the New York Life building. They hired me to, the owner of the agency knew a person higher up than the creative director at Decca Records and got them to agree to a shootout. So the shootout was basically competing, the art directors that had left, competing with the agency they had left from for the account. So they hired me to be their creative director and come up with something for this project. And the project turned out to be the Jesus Christ Superstar album. I had done an album for International Paper Company before this, about 6 months before this opportunity came up. And it was a off-Broadway play for International Paper Company. It was like a national sales meeting that was a play and skits and songs and all that stuff. And there was an album cover designed for that and given to the participants. So I had that album cover as experience. We went to the briefing. The project was the Jesus Christ Superstar album by 2 unknowns, Tim Rice and Andrew Lloyd Webber, who nobody had ever heard of. And they had this Jesus Christ Superstar concept and album that was kind of like holding on to a hot potato, because there was a lot of controversy with that album, and the church and the record company was uptight, and everything was kind of crazy. But it went ahead, and I won the project. I had given myself 4 days to come up with an idea because I wanted to present before the other agency presented, who had already been briefed for a week. So we met on a Monday I made the presentation on Friday, and they chose those Angels, and that was kind of the start of the record thing for me. And I then I had a very aggressive headhunter that used to place me in an agency long enough to not have to pay the money back that he gets. I had been at the agency that I did Jesus Christ Superstar for about 6 months, and there were a couple other albums that I had done there because Decca then started giving us all the album cover stuff to do. And the headhunter calls and he said, I've got an agency that just does album covers and they need a creative director. And, you know, I was a designer, man. I went from being out of college as a designer to being a creative director in about 1.5 years, which would normally take, that's like in the Army becoming a PFC to a general in, you know, that's a whole lifetime if you could even do it. And I just sort of skipped over a bunch of pay slots and went right to a creative director, which was kind of funny. But this guy was in the same kind of situation. He had a project that was given to him by a kid that he grew up with, a guy named Marshall Chess, whose dad owned Chess Records. And that was sold to Atlantic, and they put his dad in charge of, he was the president of Atlantic, and he put his son in charge of managing the Rolling Stones, and they needed a logo. So he went to his friend, the guy that I was interviewing with, to do a logo for the Rolling Stones. And I'm you know, presenting the Jesus Christ Superstar stuff and the Dolls Alive, which was the International Paper Company sales meeting, to this guy. And he's looking at the Dolls Alive piece that has a pair of lips on the record label of the album. And so I'm showing him that album, and he opens it up and he's looking at the record label, and he starts telling me the story about how he and Marshall had grown up, and Marshall's come back to him now to get a logo for the Stones. And if I were to take that pair of lips and just go upstairs to his art department and put a tongue on the outside of those lips, you know, he thinks he could sell it to the Rolling Stones.
Wow.
So I go upstairs to his art department. I spend about 15 minutes drawing a tongue on the outside, add a few teeth, and took it back downstairs to him. And he had a little 3-story brownstone on 53rd between Madison and Park. So it was just off Madison Avenue. And it was great because they just did album covers. It was all young people. I was in my 20s, and they were all the same age. And everybody was just like, it was like kicking ass against the establishment. You know, I had come from, you know, college in Oakland and UC Berkeley and all that stuff, and the People's Parks and, you know, all the stuff that was going on that. And then all of a sudden I land in this agency that's just doing stuff in that industry, because music played a big part of it. Music was a big part of the 60s, even, you know, when I was in college. And then we'll talk about the British invasion when I was in college and how that changed everything. But so, you know, that really kind of was very interesting to me. He took the sketch that I had done, took it to Marshall Chess, who was at Andy Warhol's factory in Lower Manhattan, showed it to him, and came back a couple hours later, had me stick around, and said, okay, you know, you just designed a logo for the Rolling Stones, and I'm gonna hire you in a few weeks and give you some projects to do in the interim. And, you know, I got $200 in a job. So
Wow.
that's how it worked. And then, you know, and then I did some other albums for that company, like Grand Funk Railroad's big, you know, E Pluribus Funk, and there were a few other ones. And at that time, everything was changing in the music business. The sound was coming no longer from the East Coast in Chicago and Detroit and places. It was coming in Motown. Motown was always Motown, but the rock and roll part of it was now coming from San Francisco and Los Angeles. This is in the late 60s, 69, 70, everything was in the whole hippie movement, and all that stuff was happening around that same time. And so the guy that we work for wanted to establish an office in Los Angeles, a satellite office, so he could, you know, get in on part of that business. That business, his business was actually selling packaging to record companies, because record companies weren't buying the packaging for albums directly from printers. They were buying it from brokers. He was a broker. And back in the day when you'd buy an album in a record store, you guys don't know what those are, but there were stores that actually just sold records, you know, rows and rows of records. And there were little stickers on the album, on the cellophane that went around the album, that said, you know, this album contains the hit single, Dr. My Eyes, you know, Jackson Browne. And so that was his main thing. And he actually did the first, when album covers changed, along with everything else. Now the movement's going from east to west, the music's coming from the west. all these recording studios, Sunset Sound, Wally Hyder, they're popping up like crazy in Los Angeles and San Francisco. And so, you know, he wanted to be part of that. So he actually sent myself and his vice president out to Los Angeles to start his satellite office. And, you know, in the interim, you know, we were promised all this work. It never happened. But what I had done was I used to read a lot of the publications like Billboard and Record World, Cashbox. Those were the record business Bibles. And in Billboard, they used to have a little article called Bubbling Under, and it would say who was in the studio, who's getting ready to go out on tour, and all that stuff. So I found out, this is probably 4 or 5 months before I came out to Los Angeles with his vice president, that Alice Cooper was in the studio. Both Alice Cooper and Cheech and Chong were in the studio recording albums, and that Alice's album was School's Out. There was no title yet for Cheech and Chong. So I did these 2 comps. I created hand designed and you know, kind of lettered and with markers, made it look like a real album. I did a school desk for Alice, and I did a big bamboo cigarette paper package for Cheech and Chong. And they were just comps. They weren't printed pieces. I handmade them. And I didn't tell anybody about them because I was hoping that I could somehow connect. Supposedly a lot of the work that we were promised by the guy we worked for was going to come from A&M Records. A&M Records had another label under them called Ode Records, and that was Carole King and Cheech and Chong. It was Lou Adler, who was the owner of Ode Records, and it was being distributed by A&M, and it was on the same lot, which was the Charlie Chaplin old movie lot in Los Angeles, right off Sunset. And so, you know, I put together these comps in hopes that I could somehow, you know, get to one of these guys. You know, our whole job was to create a satellite office, build the art department, build the sales for the art department, and have a viable, you know, resource on the West Coast. And when that work didn't materialize, I had shared those 2 comps with the vice president of the company that I came out to Los Angeles with to start he was going to do the business end, I was going to do the art end. And so I showed those to him, and he loved them. And the next day he called up Lou Adler at Ode Records and said, hey, you know, we're out here from New York. We've got the creative director that did Jesus Christ Superstar and the Rolling Stones song and all these other things. And we have an idea for Cheech and Chong for an album cover that we'd like to show you. No obligation on your part. If you give us 15 minutes of your time, we'll love to show you this idea. So he agreed to that. Then he picked up the phone and called Shep Gordon over at Alive, which was Alice's manager, and told him basically the same thing he had told Lou Adler. We have an idea for Alice Cooper, you know, and we'd love to show it to you. Can you give us 15 minutes of your time? And this was on like a Thursday, as I remember. And Shep, unlike Lou, who agreed to a meeting, said, you know, have you ever seen Alice live? And of course not. I mean, you know, he was just starting. Under My Wheels became a big hit, you know, and so he set us up for coming to a concert at the Palladium. And that's a whole nother story. I guess I'm going on too far. You asked me a simple question. I'm giving you a whole, you know, breakdown of everything. But it was those 2 things really sort of started it all for us. At the same time, when I was in college, you know, the whole English invasion was starting to happen. The Beatles were coming out, you know, they were part of it. The music was, you know, becoming from San Francisco stuff. All that stuff was happening around the same time when I was in college. A lot of the kids that I went to college with, it was a small art school, had 125 kids. Most of them lived in communes in Haight-Ashbury. So we'd go over there and party on the weekends with them. And, you know, I remember many times being out in front of Grunt Records, which was this big Victorian gingerbread house with all this crazy coloring and stuff. And it was the Jefferson Airplane's headquarters. And, you know, and I told you when we talked the other day, I said it was really strange for me because here I am out in front of their place at night on everybody's, you know, passing around and incense burning and the head shops and the black lights and all that stuff. And everybody's smoking pot and dropping acid and stuff. It was kind of crazy. And then a few years later, I'm inside with the Jefferson Airplane. It was crazy. I mean, that happened to me a lot. It was almost surrealistic to be able to have such a passion for music, and the people that I really liked the music for, I was working with. I mean, and that's very surrealistic. And I wish one of the big things that I wish that I would have been able to do was something for the Beatles, because they were instrumental in changing, as far as I'm concerned, everything they touched. There wasn't anything that they didn't touch, and with 3 guitars and a drum, that's crazy. I mean, how does anybody do that? I mean, it was way beyond anybody's imagination. And one of the other things that you and I talked about was how they changed the way music was presented to consumers. When I was in high school, everybody was used to music. Like, if I liked the Platter song and it was a hit single, the next hit single would sound a lot like that song. You could tell it was a Platter song. It was similar. So it felt comfortable, and they figured, hey, well, if this one sold, this one should sell, because that's the sound people want to hear. The
Right.
Beatles came along and changed all that. I remember the first single, and then the next one it was different, and then the next album was different, and unlike albums up to that time where maybe you had 1 or 2 singles on that album, every song on a Beatles album was amazing. I mean, it was just, and whether it was the early ones or the later ones, it was just always, they were changing and evolving. And up until then, music was really kind of stagnant. It really was waiting for something unique. And they came along, and even before the Rolling Stones, before any of them, the Beatles came along and changed it all. And I think I told you, when I was in 1963, I was in the Army, and when we would go on leave on the weekends and stuff, we would go and buy Beatles boots and Beatle wigs, because you had to have short hair and you couldn't have a beard or anything. But none of the Beatles had that, but they had the long hair, and it wasn't really that long. But you could buy Beatle wigs and Beatle boots, so you could look like even though you're in the Army and you got short hair, and you could look like you were cool, because
Right.
they were cool. The Beatles were, like I said, they were in the right spot at the right time. I found in my career, it's all about timing. No matter how creative you are, I know a lot of people that are more creative than I am, but the timing was never right. So many things come into it. To be in the right spot at the right time is critical, but then you have to have the right stuff. So, I mean, and it's like when people say, all the planets are aligning, and so it's the right time. Well, that's kind of how successful, when you become successful at what you do, and I mean successful not monetarily, but successful with loving what you do, so you don't have to have a job. That to me is success. I've never had to have a job. I sit down with pens and pencils and draw all day, and just like you were in art school, in art class, it was the best class you had all day long. It was, everybody looked forward to art, and it was an easy grade to get, but you had a lot of fun. And I've spent the last 52 years having a lot of fun, and again, being in the right spot at the right time. And then, Alice Cooper was a huge advocate for us. Shep Gordon, his manager, is amazing. Alice was amazing. And when I met him in that office, when we went to the concert, and I'll just make a long story short, they warned people not to come to the concert. If you have a weak heart, don't come to this concert. We have nurses, we have doctors on staff here, but if you're pregnant, if you have a weak heart, you have any kind of, don't come to this concert. So that's like telling you can't do something, and the first thing you want to do is that. So the place was packed, and throughout, at a certain point in the concert, when they were doing the West Side Story kind of takeoff on the Sharks and the Jets, there's a heckler in the audience who Alice ignored at first, but then started interacting with, called him up on stage. And when the guy got up on stage, Alice pulled out a switchblade and stabbed him. And the guy falls over on the ground. People are like, what just happened? And the lights go out. It's so dark in there, you can't even see the hand in front of your face, okay?
Wow.
Lights come back on a couple minutes later, and the band's playing in the background. You hear the band, and then the lights come on, and Alice is going up the steps with a guard on each side of him to the judge that's sitting up on the thing, and condemns him to death for killing the guy, right? Lights go out. A couple minutes later, the lights come back on. Alice is in the straitjacket. The drum is building to the crescendo, and he's going up the steps. They put the noose around his neck, okay? And that bottom drops out, and he's dangling like this. Women are passing out. People are freaking out. I mean, screaming and yelling. It's like, and then the lights go out, and you don't hear anything, you don't see anything. And a couple minutes later, the lights come on, and nobody's on the stage. So everybody's like stamping their feet and yelling, "Hey, we want an encore, encore." No encore.
Wow.
No encore. Okay. And after a while, everybody files out. And the first thing you do is you get back home, or you get in your car and you turn on the radio. You get to your favorite rock station. And that time, I think it was K10 or whatever it was there in LA. And the disc jockeys are talking about, yeah, it seems like there was a major accident that happened at Alice Cooper's concert tonight. Something messed up, and we heard that he hung himself. And he's dead. And so all these people are freaking out, and they're calling into the disc jockeys and stuff. And the disc jockeys were all part of it. They were working in tandem with Shep Gordon, who's a genius and pulls all this stuff off, and the Alice Cooper group. And so everybody thinks he's dead, right? So Monday comes, we go into the meeting at Alive. We go in, there's Shep behind his desk, and there's Alice sitting on the couch drinking a beer. And it's like, oh my God, this is amazing. And from that day on, that was in 1971. That was like October, November, December, 1971, when we were working on the School's Out album. And from that day on, I mean, we just bonded, and they were really beneficial in helping Pacific Pioneer, my company.
Can you walk me through the first time you heard the Beatles? Like, were you in art college at that point in the Bay Area?
The first time I remember hearing the Beatles, I was in the Army. This is 1963. And they were really coming out, they had their singles and like I had the whole, Beatle haircuts and the way they dressed, and everything was so unique about them. And that I remember them from like the early 60s. And then by the time I was in college, I mean, one of the big albums for me was the Strawberry Fields album. That cut was just, it was like an anthem around my art school, and there were a lot of people at my school taking acid, and our teachers were taking acid. And I mean, it was a very small college, and it was very geared toward just artists.
Did the Beatles influence your life in any way aside from just music taste?
In college, I was taking a lot of different classes and changing my major every semester. I think the Beatles had a lot to do with that, because again, like back to what I was saying, they changed the way you heard music. They changed the way music was presented to fans, to consumers. I mean, it was not like you would normally hear. They changed it. It's like throwing a snowball down a hill, and by the time it gets midway down, it's like a mountain. And that's what the Beatles did. There wasn't anything that you could name that they didn't touch. And that you couldn't say that about a lot of things. Couldn't say that about, I can't think of another group that I could say that did that. Not really. I mean, even, people like Jimi Hendrix, he didn't change everything. Not like the Beatles did. I mean, and as much as I liked, Jimi Hendrix, I mean, I remember the first time I heard, I was in like junior year of high school, and a friend of mine was a guitar player in a local band, Willie Scott and the Velveteens, and he was a bass player, and he was always into new music. And I remember being in his house one day, and he's playing the Jimi Hendrix Experience album, and it was like, my God, I never heard anything like this. This is totally unlike anything I ever heard. Well, the Beatles were like that too. And even though their music wasn't like Jimi Hendrix music, it was music that the masses could relate to. It was music that touched everybody. Unlike, I don't like Jimi Hendrix, too weird. I don't like Bob Dylan, the guy can't sing. Forget about the message. And the Beatles were able to convey a message and make it so everybody loved it. I mean, everybody loved the Beatles. Even though I did the Rolling Stones song, when I was asked to do that, yeah, for me, it was an assignment. If it would have been a Beatles logo, oh, shit. Are you kidding me? That would have been, I mean, I couldn't even imagine that. And I remember one time when Wings got formed, and they were at Wally Heider Studio in Los Angeles, right off of Cahuenga there. And our studio was in the crossroads of the world, about a block away. And we were coming back from lunch, and the Wally Heider parking lot was right there. And this Rolls Royce pulls up, and it's Paul McCartney, it's Linda McCartney, it's a couple other musicians, and they go into the recording studio. So I remember I ran back to our office, man. I got our brochure and I ran back there and put it on the windshield, under the windshield wiper of their limousine. And never heard anything from them, but I mean,
Wow.
yeah, they were always aspirational. I mean, I've had a few bands like that. Green Day is another band like that for me. So that's kind of how it all kind of started for me. Being a kid, loving to draw comics and Mickey Mouse and Donald Duck, and then actually taking art classes in junior high school, having a great teacher. Had an awesome teacher in high school that really saw the value that I could bring as a creative person, and he was really instrumental in helping me get into college, because I never wanted to go to college. I was always too busy. I had a 57 Chevy, and I dragged the main every weekend, and girls and rock and roll and stuff like that. And it just Wolfman Jack, I mean, it was just
Right.
not what I had ever really thought about doing, going to college. And certainly if I did, I mean, what would I do? I mean, like, I'm not a mathematician, or I'm not an English guy. I mean, I did art. For me, it wasn't really ever about the money. Even with Pacific Pioneer, I mean, it was never about the money. It was about doing the work. And that's why I was able to do, I'm 249 album covers that I've done, which is quite a few, and had great experiences with almost every one of them. Made a lot of rock and roll friends, did a lot of great work. And the other part of that was, I didn't do it by myself. It was a team, and everything I've ever done has been a team effort, whether it's one person and myself or 5 people and myself. Pacific Pioneer was kind of like a starting base for a lot of people that were coming up at the time. And I used to compare in my mind, I compare Pacific Pioneer and what we did and how we started and who it was, a lot like a band, getting started. I know you play guitar, I play the drums, I got a garage where we can rehearse in, I got an amplifier, and then we got a friend in school who's a bass player, and this guy's a songwriter and a singer. And before you know it, you're like gigging in your garage, you're gigging in your neighborhood. Then you start doing local gigs, at high school proms and whatever you want to do it. And that's what we did. We leaped over a lot of that and went right to making a hit single. We started out in a garage. There was 2 of us, started Pacific Pioneer in a 1-bedroom cabin up at the top of, right near Capitol Records, up in the Hollywood Hills. We had this 1-bedroom, 3 of us, my wife and I and my partner lived there. Kitchen table became my partner's business office. The dining room, coffee table became my art department. And that's how we started. And as we built the company, we were lucky enough to surround ourselves with other people that were coming up at the same time. Just like musicians, Jimi Hendrix, and, there's this guy, and this guy goes from this group to that group, and Buffalo Springfield, and then the Yardbirds, and all these guys are moving around looking for the right connection, looking for the right chemistry. And that's how Pacific Pioneer started. I mean, by the time, at a certain point, at the middle of 1972, we had been started for about 6 months. We had a production artist, kid named Dean Marion, and he and I were the art department. My partner Tony was the sales department. My wife Bonnie was the accountant that took care of the billing. And we worked out of this 1-bedroom house. Then we moved down to the crossroads of the world. And along comes a kid named Drew Struzan, who was just out of college, okay, and needed a job. He had just been married. He has a brand new baby. Nobody will give him a job. Okay. And I had stopped looking at portfolios because it's just too much time. And I was doing everything. I was doing all the designing, the illustrating, the graphics, whatever, and Dean was doing all the production. And I couldn't take time out to see other people's work. So I stopped seeing it, but I had made an appointment a couple of weeks earlier with this kid. He shows up on a Saturday. I'm working on a Jefferson Airplane assignment, and he shows me his book. And it's like looking at like a Michelangelo's portfolio. If you can imagine Michelangelo having a portfolio, that's what it was like. Looking at this guy's work, it was like unbelievable. And, he just needed a job, and nobody would hire him because he was very religious. He was very fixed on how he worked. I work from Monday to Friday, 9 to 5. I don't work weekends, and I'm in by 9 and I'm out by 5. And a lot of people didn't like that, but the work was just unbelievable. For those of that don't know who Drew Struzan is, Google him. Drew Struzan, Struzan. And if you don't know him, you know his work. He did over 200 movie posters for Raiders of the Lost Ark, Star Wars, E.T., you name it. He changed what the Beatles did to music. Drew Struzan did to motion picture movie posters. You've seen his work. His work is global. It's used in every country. The language changes. It's not in English anymore. It's in Iraq, in Arabic, or it's in Chinese or whatever, Spanish, but it's always his artwork. So you know who he is. And I gave him his first job out of college, which was, and the other people that joined us, Bill Garland, Joe Garnett, Ingrid Hinkey, they were all doing the same thing. They were coming up. They were out of college. They were looking for work. And album covers were what everybody wanted to do because it was real. The crazier you were, the more everybody liked it, So It wasn't like working in an agency where you sort of had to, these focus groups and these people that all had opinion about stuff. It was you and the band. And if the band loved it, that was all that mattered. The manager would go along with the band. The record companies would have to go along because they had given control to the groups, because that was another thing that was going on at that time. Because rock and roll was changing, and that whole hippie sound and everything from the, Northern California was happening, the record companies were scrambling to sign groups. So they would give them all kinds of perks. Like, if you let us sign your group, Jack, we'll give you, we'll give you the right to who's going to produce your album, where it's going to be produced, all the way down to who's going to design your album and what printing company is going to do your printing for your cover. Because along with everything else that was changing, another big thing that was changing at that time was album packaging. You guys are too young to remember this because you probably didn't even have albums when you were kids, but there were what they call paper wrap album covers. It was a front and a back, and it had a sleeve that you put the record in and went into this front and back album, front and back cover. It was a chipboard piece of board that was, and then they took 2 pieces of printed material and adhered it to the cover. So, and the back cover. So the front cover was printed and would loop over the back a little bit. And then they had a back cover that they'd glue onto that. And that would sort of seal what was wrapping around into place. And they would, but so that was moving, the industry was moving away from that, or the musicians were moving away from that, because you couldn't do die cuts, you couldn't do embossing, you couldn't do other interactive things that you would do, like a big wallet for Alice Cooper, or the Rolling Stones package, sticky finger with the zipper in it. You couldn't do that with a paper wrap package. It had to be printed on board, the same way a cosmetics box is printed. They don't print it on paper and wrap it to a piece of board. They print right on the board. So when you do that, you're able to do die cutting, you're able to do embossing, you're able to do all these great things, because the tangencies are not like paper where you can't really control it, So that was changing at the same time when the Beatles were coming along. I mean, and the first interactive album that's really changed it all was the Velvet Underground, that white cover with the banana on it. Okay, and you could peel the banana off and put it back on. Well, the guy that I went to work for did that sticker. He did that banana sticker. So when you pull it off, the pink banana's underneath, and you could stick it back on and it would stick.
Right.
And it was printed on board. Wasn't printed on paper wrapped to board. So, and the cost difference was a lot. Paper wrap packages are about 6 cents. A board package is probably 18 cents. And then what would happen is, they would sign these bands and they would spend all this money doing a board package because everybody wanted to do board. Everybody wanted die cuts and embossing and things that turned into something else. And, they spend all this money on a package and the group sells, 50 albums. So they're taking in the shorts. So they started by the mid groups having the kind of control that I was talking about started in the late 60s, early 70s. It went on, and by 1984, it was over. It was in what I call the golden age of custom album packaging, where you could make a big wallet, you could make a cigarette lighter, we did a Jefferson Airplane thing that folded up into a dope cleaning box. It actually had sides, and the record stayed in a heavy-duty sleeve that went in with the rest of your record collection. So you couldn't do that with a paper package. And so that whole thing was really, like I said, if you look back, it started with the Velvet Underground album, and by the mid 80s, it was over. The groups had lost all control. The record companies had taken it all back, and then other things were changing as well. So, but that era when the British invasion happened and the Beatles came on is everything in music. That was the same. All those other things were going on at the same time. And so we got groups like Black Sabbath and the Jefferson Airplane, the Doors, Jesus Christ Superstar, the Rolling Stones. I mean, like I said, 249 album covers is a lot, and I had to fight for each and every one of those because our biggest competitor was not other companies like Pacific Pioneer. There were maybe three. It was Hypnosis in England, who did all the Pink Floyd covers. That's Hypnosis, and they did a lot of mainly photography. Pacific Pioneer was mainly illustration. Well, I had 5 staff illustrators and a staff photographer, and it was great for me because I could and I had these guys that we could stand toe to toe to anybody. There was nobody doing stuff like we were doing. They couldn't. How would they compete with Drew Struzan? How would you compete with Bill Garland or Joe Garnett? These guys were major players because of the work that we were able to get that they were able to execute. So then Drew became so popular that he was hired away by the movie business from me. And it was all on good terms. I mean, Bill Garland and Carl Ramsey, those 3 illustrators were hired away from Pacific Pioneer by major movie company design firms. There's a firm called Tony Seiniger, and his whole thing was just movie posters. And he could afford to pay these guys, 5 times what I could pay them. And it wasn't like, hey, we're going to leave unless you match the price. They knew I couldn't do it. We didn't have the kind of budgets for movie posters or even our corporate work to be able to give them what this guy was, it would just keep raising the price. Okay, you won't do it for, 10,000 a sketch. We'll give you 20,000, because it didn't matter. They're spending millions and millions of dollars on the movies. This firm was doing 80% of the movie posters. So Drew was able to get, because of where he ended with us, and where he ended with us was the Welcome to My Nightmare cover. Okay, that for Alice Cooper, that was kind of the evolution of his style, coming from Art Center when I hired him, where he was a painter, to being an illustrator 5 years later and going into the movie poster business and changing the whole look and feel of movie posters. He's the guy. I have 73 of his original pieces that we did together in the record business. I don't have any of his movie poster stuff, but to me, the record stuff is more valuable because it's fewer pieces. I've got maybe 35 pieces of his music stuff, a lot of corporate stuff, which is really rare. And he's done over 200 and something movie posters. It's like having Picasso's Blue Period. Picasso's, all of his work is very expensive, but try and buy a Blue Period piece, and there were only 38 of them. That they're untouchable. They're priceless.
Right.
So, and that's how his stuff is that we have in it. And again, it's all part of, what we became, what I'm still doing. I've always had the philosophy that, you leave it better than you found it. Okay. I think that I've made a mark. If I died tomorrow, as long as people have ears and eyes, what I've done, the mark that I've made with these covers, And so the corporate work, not so much. The album covers, because of the exposure and the generations that keep rediscovering. I do a campaign for Nestle for their, their Turtles chocolate, and it's a successful campaign, but your generation would never remember it. Even if I told you what it was, you wouldn't remember it. I could say Alice Cooper, or I could say the Beatles, or I could say Led Zeppelin, and you'll know exactly what I'm talking about, because every generation re-experiences it, rediscovers it, along with the new stuff, with hip hop and rap and grunge and punk. It all has a place. But the one thing that seems to be consistent across all of them that come and go is rock and roll. And the Beatles were a huge part of that, man. I mean, they were amazing.
And what is it about them that makes them so amazing?
Their songs were simple. Their songs could be relevant today. You could listen to a Beatles song and go, you know what? That was just recorded. That's a beautiful song. And the harmony and three guitars and a drum. Are you crazy? I mean, who would say that three guitars and a drum could do what they've done? Never happened. Never in a minute. I would throw you out of my office. Every record company passed on them, Well, you know all that. I'm telling you stuff that you already know. Every record company. I mean, and it was at a time, okay, so every record company passed on them, but understand there's a bigger part of that record companies are looking for any group. They want to just get groups to their label. They're willing to give up stuff to get groups, and they pass on the Beatles. I don't, I mean, what, they got shit for ears? I mean, come on, it's just, it was just, they're amazing. There's nobody like them. There has never been anybody like them, in music. I mean, you have like your Frank Sinatras, you have your, Eddie Cantor, you have your Al Jolsons. You can go back in music as far as you want to go back and bring it up to today. There's never been anybody like those four guys. Three guitars and a drum, I mean.
Do you have a favorite Beatle?
Yeah, both Bonnie and I love Ringo.
Oh, Ringo, nice.
Yeah. We were at the Bangladesh concert. When we first went to New York, we went to see Grand Funk Railroad and PG&E, and then we went to the Bangladesh. That was at the Fillmore East. Then we went to the Madison Square Garden to Bangladesh, and we had seats that were up on the second level and to the right. So our angle of the stage was at an angle where we could see Ringo on the drums. He was like the main guy we were looking at, and we both loved him. He had his pants leg rolled up and had this little drum set. It was like you look at some of these bands and the drummers, man, they got 1,000 drums and all these cymbals. And it looked like a kid's drum set. And
right.
He was just a great drummer, and Starkey, the guy, I guess, that was there before him, I mean, you talk about bad timing, I mean, you don't think that the group's going to go anywhere. And the next thing you know, they're the biggest thing, but it needed Ringo. That was what it was missing. Not that he's the best drummer in the whole world. And the other guy could have been a better drummer, but he didn't have the personality. He didn't have the look. It goes along with the talent. The look has to be there. And that's the other thing the Beatles had. They had the look. George, John, Paul, and Ringo. Each one of them looked different. Each one of them had a different personality. Each one had their own personal fan club,
Right.
And yeah, I mean, it was Ringo all the way, no doubt about it. Even though I love John Lennon and Paul McCartney and the harmonies that they would make and the songs they wrote, Ringo to me seemed like the most approachable. He seemed like he'd be a really cool guy. And a good friend of mine, Burton Cummings from the Guess Who, American Woman, These Eyes, he's my best friend. And he was on one of the Ringo's All-Stars. He did tours.
Oh, yeah.
And Burton was on there with Joe Walsh and a couple of guys from the Eagles and Jimmy Schmitz and Ringo Starr. And he said that Ringo Starr was just the most amazing guy. He was just really, down to earth. And he toured with them with that whole tour, one whole tour. And they would do each other's songs and stuff live. And, Ringo was cool with all that. And I guess now his son is a drummer too, right?
Right. Yeah.
And they all have sons, right?
Yeah.
And it would be great. Like I think you had mentioned that if the kids would get together and do a Beatles reunite, with
Right. Yeah.
the players, the sons of the players, and does Paul McCartney have a son?
He does. Yeah. He's got a son named James. I think he has a couple of albums, but I'm not sure what he's been up to recently.
Yeah. Well, it's
Yeah.
hard living in the shadow of something like that,
Oh yeah.
They expect so much, and even people will be cruel, saying, "Ah, you're not anywhere near like your father or whatever." That's a hard thing to live under. I mean,
Yeah.
trying to come up to that. I mean, I was pretty lucky. I was the only artist in my family, so I didn't have to overachieve anybody else. In my family, like, "Oh, you're not your father." Like
Right.
Wyatt, J.C. Wyatt. And living up to his dad and what he had done, N.C. Wyatt. I mean, it's got to be hard to live like, under a shadow of something like that. But
Oh yeah.
I,
Absolutely.
that's why I never had kids. Yeah, I wouldn't want to put them through that. No, I'm
Right.
just kidding. I'm kidding.
Yeah, I got one more question for you, Ernie. Actually, two. So
Okay.
they both have to do with album covers. My first question is, in hindsight, which album cover that you've done is your absolute favorite or the one that you're most proud of? My second question is, do you have a Beatles album that you would have liked to do the cover for?
No, good questions. Good questions. To answer the first question, I've done so many, and I each one of them is, and I've done a couple of different series where there were, like these old blues singers. I did a series of 50, it was called Gold Dust series, and there were like 15 of them. I created a format, and then each one sort of had a family look to the design and stuff. And I like those for a reason, but it's not the same reason that I like the Alice Cooper covers for. I mean, each one, it's like a child. Each child you have, if you have a few or even a couple, I mean, which one do you love them both, but not for exactly the same reasons. You see the differences in them, and you love those and you nurture those. And I would say I would break it down more like what was the most fun album that I ever had, and that was definitely the Sesame Street Live album. And I just, on my Facebook page, I posted a couple images of it. It was great. I got a chance to go on the set in New York of Sesame Street. I got to meet Big Bird and Grover and Ernie and Bert,
That's awesome.
and yeah, and create this album that was kind of it folded out like this, and there were kids on these two end panels, and it went in with more kids, and then there was all the characters from Sesame Street on a stage. So it was like you were there in the audience looking in at all these people on stage. And then on the when you turned it over, I took the numbers 1 through 10 and made them really big and fun and cartoon looking, and gave them dimension and put pictures all over. And then there was a big poster that was inside that had all the songs that were on the album, and we got to illustrate around each song. So I mean, it's beautiful. It's this big poster with all these songs illustrated. So that was the most fun poster. I mean, the most fun cover. The prettiest cover I think I ever did was Burton Cummings' "Dream of a Child." I don't know whether you're familiar with that. It was a triple platinum album, but it was this photo shoot that we did in my front room. I had a house in Silver Lake, and it was an old Victorian house. And we were sitting this scene up on the floor. There was a piano, a little piano that I got, and I painted blue. And I had my secretary's kid was in there, and we had this satin sheet and this big blow up of Burton, a portrait of him. And this kid was in the shot, and I designed this nice lettering that said "Dream of a Child." And we're looking at it, and we got the camera set up, and it just wasn't. There was something. The composition was great. Everything was kind of neat looking, but there was something missing. And the room we were sitting it up in, behind off to the side was our front door, and it had one of those little windows that you look out and see who's there. And it had a little Venetian blind. It was like maybe this big. And for some reason, I turned around and opened up the blind to where it threw this light down on what we were shooting that looked like piano keys, or it looked like it looked like strips on the side of film. There was something really, I mean, it was amazing. It was because the sun was at exactly the right position in the sky that threw that light in there and cast that shadow. We shot it, and it's absolutely phenomenal. The cover is
Wow.
probably the prettiest cover I ever did. And it, like I said, it just wasn't working. And opening that blind, boom, it changed the whole thing. And check it out. Dream of a Child, Burton Cummings. And
Wow.
and then I would say the 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 craziest albums that we ever did were for Alice. You know, I mean, we had so much fun because, again, like I said earlier, there was so much to work with. But he also wanted something that was different than everybody else every time we did a cover. Okay. And he really loved the idea of creating. One of the things that we did with our covers was our job was to create the emotional link between the musician, their music, and the fan. So we need to create a graphic or a pictorial bridge that connected those elements to each other. That's what we did. And it was an emotional connection that we created. And Alice he was open to everything that we did. $1 Billion Baby's a big wallet, you know, from the inside, Crazy Doors with an insane asylum that we shot all this photography at. The Muscle of Love cover, I don't know whether you're familiar with that, but it looked like a cardboard box that came with pornography in it and this grease stain along the bottom. And, you know, I mean, and then we did a photo shoot because the whole idea was Muscle of Love was at the time we did that cover, mud wrestling was a huge thing. Okay, everybody was going to the mud wrestling thing. And it was usually women, you know, in mud pits wrestling with people in the audience or whatever with each other. And it was before strip clubs, I guess. But so we did this idea of sailors on leave going to a mud wrestling place. Okay, and the front of the album cover front and back is a cardboard box. It's about this thick. And inside is a book cover for your school books. There's a sleeve that's got graphics on both sides. And the way that package opens up, there's a die cut on the back that looks like a penis. So when you open it up, it looks like just, you know, from the back. So, and then you see this, it must be a sex tool in there because there's this grease stain along the bottom of the package that was printed, you know, and so the inside sleeve, we wanted to, on one side, it's like Alice and the group going to a mud wrestling place. And, you know, it's got the windows with the mud wrestling and you come on in and you got the awning and all the signage. And there's the hooker on the outside and there's a little midget that's the pimp. And that was Angie. He was Angie. He was a famous actor. He was in Thunderdome. He was the Master Blaster on the guys. That's Angie. And he was in all these old movies. He was Bela Lugosi's midget. He was his dwarf that followed him around as minion, you know, in all the Bela Lugosi vampire movies. So he was big in Hollywood, and we got him to be in these photo shoots.
Wow.
So, and then when you put on the front of the sleeve, there was a picture of them, and we made the front of our building in the Crossroads of the World look like a mud wrestling place. Had a big pagoda-shaped window, and we painted the windows that looked like a mud wrestling saloon or whatever. And the guys are going in, and Alice is in the foreground with all this money. And then on the backside, they are all beat up and thrown out because it was a gorilla that was actually wrestling in the mud with them. So he kicked ass on all of them. And then there was another picture of them all on KP duty in the ship, right? In the galley. And there's this big greasy cook that's making this stuff on the stove, and they're all peeling potatoes and they're all beat up and stuff, you know, and we didn't have the money to do a set. So we found out that the Scientologists had a boat in San Pedro Harbor. So we went on the boat and did the photo shoot there. It was crazy. And they hounded me for years to come and get audited and all that stuff. Because I was stupid. I put my real name and contact over everybody else but phony names and stuff. And so they hounded me for years, man. I mean, it was crazy. But, you know, I mean, so that would have been some of the craziest albums. And then, you know, other people like Melanie. You know, you probably don't know who she was, but okay, I did 3 albums for her, and then a lot of comedy albums. George Carlin, Flip Wilson, Franklin Ajayi, Cheech and Chong. Those were fun albums. I had a lot of them were fun. To have a favorite one favorite, it's hard. It would be hard for any. I love them all for different reasons, and I love them all. And it's not just because it's an ego thing. It's more of like, what it's like? It's like having fun moments in your life that you never forget. That's
Right.
exactly what it's like. Each time you think of it, or you see a picture of it, you remember everything about it and what made it so memorable and what made it stick in your mind. And that's how these covers are with me. I mean, even more than the corporate work. I've done a lot of really great corporate work that you would know if I told you, but it's not the same as music where it's rediscovered over and over again. And for me, that's like the biggest pleasure I get, like knowing that I made a mark. Isn't that what we all want to do? We all want to leave a mark that says Kilroy was here, or I was here. I mean, and I've done that. I've done that 249 times. It's really kind of neat, and so, I mean, I don't know whether that answers your question enough, but that's kind of how it is with me. And as far as the favorite Beatles album, I think that Rubber Soul, Revolver. I got a chance to meet Klaus Vormann, the illustrator that did that cover for Revolver.
Oh,
He is
wow.
an artist as well as a musician. He's an accomplished artist. And there was an artist that went to work. The first illustrator that came to work for Pacific Pioneer was a guy named Joe Garnett. Rest his soul, he just passed away last year. And, he was a great friend. We did a lot of work together, great work. He's the one that did the Doors Full Circle painting and beautiful stuff. And Klaus Vormann was his studio. They shared a studio together in Los Angeles. And I got a chance to meet him. Really nice guy. I would have loved to have been able to do that cover. I would have loved to do any Beatles cover because, like I said, they were, and it is as much accolade as I get or recognition as I get for the Rolling Stones done. For me, that was a project that I like the Stones, but it wouldn't have been the same as if I would have been able to do a Beatles cover. Beatles were my guys. The fact that I always wanted to be versatile and have different things that I was doing versus just being an album cover designer or just being a Madison Avenue ad guy. Having the variety is what keeps you young. It's what I say. It's what keeping me making history instead of becoming it. Because a lot of the people that I've worked with, my peers, have become history.
Wow.
And I don't want to be history. I want to make it. I've always made it my whole career. If we started at some point, maybe you can have me on again and we can talk about some of the corporate stuff. But I know it's not in the wheelhouse of what the Beatles are all about, but I was influenced by them, and by being influenced by them made me who I am today. And I'm still a huge fan. I'm a huge fan of the Stones, but I'm a bigger fan of the Beatles, because for me, they were the first ones that really changed it all, and when you're in college, and you're young like that, change is very important. How change is important in your life.
Oh, yeah.
And it's really welcomed, right? You seek it out. Guess what? When you get to be my age, change is screwed up, man. Change is scary. That means that things change. That means that the job that I had, that I was secure with, the agency the client that I had, now there's a new director and he's got his own people. So change isn't so welcome. And the Beatles were really the ones that confirmed it all for me, confirmed the fact that you need to have that variety, that you need to be not pigeonholed, that you need to have more skill set than one. So I'm very lucky. I'm still relevant because, are you familiar with John Henry and the steel driving machine?
I've heard of it. Yeah.
Okay. John Henry was this steel driving guy. He was a black guy who was a railroad guy, and he would lay down track and stuff. And he was this big muscular guy. And along came the steel driving machine, which could lay steel spikes into the rails the same way he did, only he had a sledgehammer. So there became this contest between John Henry and the steel driving machine. And at the end of it, John Henry beats it. He beats the steel driving machine. He's got a sledgehammer in each hand, and but he dies. But he beat the steel driving machine. I feel like I'm competing with that steel driving machine up until I had Bob on the computer. Now I am the steel driving machine and John Henry both. So it's crazy. I mean, it may not make a lot of sense, but to me, it makes perfect sense. I've been lucky to keep existing. Yeah. I've been able to keep relevant. And that's really if you want that moment in the sun, you got to stay relevant, whether you're a musician, whether you're an artist, whether you're a mechanic, whether you're laying drywall, whether you're a painter of houses, you just have to keep upping it. You have to keep relevant. And that's important, because if you're not, then people forget. Right. And I want to be remembered for a long time. And to this day, I'm still making history. Haven't become it yet,
And Ernie, if anyone's looking to buy your merchandise or your album artwork, where can they find that?
Okay, yeah, there's a couple of sites. The first site is pacificeyeandear.com, and the and is spelled out. So it's Pacific, PACIFICEYEANDEAR.com. And then if you want to see more of the art, I have a site that shows some of the tours that I've had. I've had 2 museum shows. The best one was at the Smithsonian Museum in Memphis. It's their first satellite museum. And that website is thefineartofrock.com. So thefineartofrock.com. And then there's originalalbumcoverart.com. And you'll see more art there. And if you don't see something that you want to know if I have, just send me a message. And there's a contact information on, I can give it to you. It's Ernie at Hornbook, HORNBOOKINK.com. So it's INK, not INC. And just tell me, do you have this or do you have that? And, like I said, I've got over 350 pieces of music art and 33 pieces for Alice, all these other bands, Black Sabbath and, Jesus Christ Superstar, the Rolling Stones song, have all that stuff, have shirts, posters, prints, hand-drawn prints, and tapestries and throws and all kinds of T-shirts, limited edition of T-shirts. But all that stuff is, available on either one of those 3 sites, or just reach out to me on my email. So that's
awesome.
It. Yeah.
Cool. Ernie, thank you so much for coming on the show.
Jack, thank you, man. And you look exactly the same as you did months ago. You
Yeah.
haven't aged at all. Me, I've aged. That's what happens.